Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Cameron, who is a professor of political science and the director of the Yale Program in European Union Studies. On June 23rd, a small majority of British voters, 52%, voted in a referendum to leave the European Union, which many did not think would happen. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, who called the referendum, resigned, and Theresa May succeeded him and formed a new government, which is preparing to negotiate the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Today, we talk with Professor Cameron about the referendum, also known as Brexit. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks, Marilyn. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So interesting times. Let's start with, kind of give us a quick overview of what happened, with the referendum that, of course, everyone is calling Brexit. And I have to say, watching Jeopardy last night, it's one of those new words. Brexit is now a new word that's been created.
It is.
So I thought that was curious. So give us an overview.
Well, what happened is that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, called this referendum. He promised back in 2013, when he was Prime Minister in a coalition government with the Liberals, and he feared that conservative voters and conservative MPs might defect to the UK Independence Party, UKIP. He said it's time to give the voters a say, have a referendum. He was going to negotiate new terms of British membership in the EU and put it to the voters. It was an electoral ploy. It worked very well. They won a majority in 2015. But as we've seen now, it was essentially a disaster for David Cameron. He lost. He didn't expect to lose. He lost. He's now not only out of the leadership and the prime ministerial position, but he's left the House of Commons. And now we're facing Brexit.
Right. Do you think the Prime Minister, Cameron, would have done things differently if hindsight was 20/20?
Absolutely. He thought he would win. You might say, was hubris. But I think also he looked at the electorate, and at the time he looked at the Conservative Party in Parliament. One of the interesting things about this referendum is that in the Conservative Party itself, it has 330 members of Parliament. More than 180 came out in favor of remaining before the referendum. So there was a clear majority in his party and an even larger majority in the Parliament in favor of staying in.
Right. I have to say, I watched that voting very closely myself because, virtually everyone was saying that it was not going to happen, that they would not vote the UK out of the EU. So I think it's mind-boggling that the people did vote to do so. And after the election, there is talk about people not understanding what they were voting for, which I find somewhat disconcerting, because now you're in a situation that you probably don't want to be in. I mean, is there a way, can they have a vote to vote again?
They could if the government was willing to have a second referendum, but Theresa May has said there won't be a second referendum. The first thing she said when she became the leader of the Conservative Party back in July was, Brexit means Brexit. And that's very straightforward. You might say also it's not only concise, but it's circular. Nevertheless, Brexit means Brexit.
Yes.
And so from her point of view and the government's point of view, even though 2/3 of the members of the cabinet are people who supported staying in, this government is going to try to exit.
Right. What I was getting at is because if the people truly didn't understand what they were voting for, does it need to be looked at again, if that's the case?
Well, it probably should be. And what's interesting is that although she has said no to a second referendum, a number of people have argued that at the least there ought to be a vote in Parliament before Theresa May acts on the process, starts the process of exiting. And that's now before the courts in the UK, and ultimately it will go to the Supreme Court.
And do you have any idea of what way that will go?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. The problem is that there's a process that the EU has for withdrawal, in which a member state has to notify the European Council of its intention to withdraw. She said at the Conservative Party conference that the government would do that no later than March of 2017. At that point, there are 2 years. The clock starts ticking. There are 2 years in which to negotiate a withdrawal agreement. If that agreement takes effect within 2 years, the UK is out. But if there's no agreement, and unless the entire membership of the European Council agrees to extend the negotiation, the UK is out without a withdrawal agreement in what would be called the hardest possible Brexit, meaning no agreement on the relationship after the exit.
Okay, it seems like I mean, this has never happened before with any other country, so it's a first-time occurrence, and I would imagine that there's a lot of questions that are involved in the process of how you move forward with this. I mean, have you read the documents that actually explain how this gets taken care of? I mean,
What
seems
happens?
Very complicated.
Do you mean in the negotiation at this point?
I mean, for the whole thing. I mean.
Well, there is a clearly stated process for what will happen next, at least procedurally. In the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007, the EU, for the first time, provided this process for a withdrawal. So we know what will happen is sometime after March 2017, the EU and the UK will negotiate. And the UK will try to get what it thinks will be the best possible deal for itself.
Right.
And the EU will negotiate with its concerns, which involve, among other things, issues such as if we give the UK continued access to our internal market for their auto exporters, for their financial services firms, will the UK in exchange accept our rules and regulations, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? Will they continue to apply the principle of free movement, meaning European Union citizens can continue to move to the UK without limitations?
Right, right.
The problem, of course, is that there are a number of interests in the UK that would like to retain the access to the internal market and the single market. Auto manufacturers, Japanese auto manufacturers, the City of London.
I mean, there's huge money involved in it.
Scotland. There are many interests that want to stay in the single market, but the quid for the quo is you have to accept free movement. You have to accept regulations and rules by the EU. You have to also make a contribution to the EU budget.
And wouldn't that be just like still being in the EU?
It would be almost, that would be a very soft Brexit. That's more or less what people are thinking of when they think of soft Brexit. You're out of the EU, but you're in a relationship where you still have the access to the internal market.
There are still some ties there.
Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein all have this kind of arrangement.
Right.
The problem is it means for the British they have to accept free movement, and of course we know immigration was a huge issue in the referendum. They have to continue to accept the rules and regulations of the European institutions, and that was a big issue for many who thought that Parliament had to regain its sovereignty. they have to accept the Court of Justice, and they have to pay money.
Right, right. So now the first real thing is this negotiation between the UK and the EU.
Right.
That, I think, will be very interesting. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it'll be very interesting because the especially interesting thing in this, of course, is that because of the 2-year clock, the EU could just sit on its hands for 2 years, let the clock tick, and the UK would be faced with an exit in March 2019 without anything, without any deal at all.
Right. And what do you think that's
So they have a lot of
possible?
leverage. The EU has a lot of leverage in this. Most of the discussion right now has been about what does the UK want? And of course, there's no consensus yet in the government about what they do want.
Right.
There's
Well,
a lot
I
of
mean,
argument about that.
The politicians of the UK pretty much wanted to stay. It's not until they let it open to the people that it became this problem. So it's a very interesting situation, I think.
Well, it raises an interesting question about the role of a referendum, because the question was given to the voters was, do you want to remain or leave? And it was really that simple. And there was no real elaboration of what the consequences of leave would be. As a result, a lot of voters reacted in a visceral way and reflecting a long-standing ambivalence in the UK about EU. Are they really part of Europe or not? And it was easy to say leave, but the consequences of that are quite dire.
Dire, right. I think also with the people voting, it was really at a time when immigration, the refugee crisis was huge, and I think that really played in as well to in the voters' minds.
I'm sure it did, yeah. There has been an increase of immigration from EU countries in recent years since 2012, especially from Central and Eastern European member states. Poland, Romania, the largest increases to the UK. So and in the context of what's been happening with Syria and the refugee flows into Europe has really put immigration on the front burner for the European public as well as the British public.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Theresa May. She's virtually unknown, I think, in this country to us. You know, give us an overview of her and how you think she will broker this deal moving forward.
Well, she's been in Parliament since 1997. Before that, she worked for 20 years in some of the time for the Bank of England and in financial services. She represents a constituency to the west of London. She has spent the last 6 years before becoming Prime Minister as Home Secretary, which is a very important, powerful position in the cabinet in charge of policing, immigration, ironically, immigration, home affairs. She was you might say, a quiet supporter of the Remain position. She wasn't an outspoken advocate, but she was supporting Remain. She's, by all accounts, a really good administrator and leader, and will be an effective Prime Minister for sure. She's got an interesting government. Boris Johnson is the Foreign Secretary, who is something of a loose cannon, there are other important Brexiters in the cabinet. They've created a new department in the government called the Department for Exiting the EU. Not a very, not a terrific name for a department, but that tells what it's in charge of at least.
You know what it is.
She now has the job of trying to put together the position that the UK will want to advocate in its negotiations. And she will be in charge of that herself. There will be a cabinet committee that she chairs that will be in charge of the negotiation on the UK side.
So, I mean, it's sounding like the UK wants a soft exit, would be my guess.
I would say there are very strong economic interest, most notably in the City of London, the financial services, where they have well over 300,000 jobs in firms that are deeply involved in all aspects of finance in the EU. But I think what we're going to see is what is taking shape is something that is neither hard nor soft. And she's made a point of saying we're not doing a hard exit or a soft exit a la Norway. We're going to do our own unique deal. A flexible Brexit is the way some people have thought about it, where what they want to do is they want free, unimpeded access to the internal market for certain important sectors, finance, auto exporters, so forth. So they want essentially all the rights to enter the market. On the other hand, they also want full control over immigration. They don't want to be under the European Court of Justice. And the question is, can they get that?
Well, I was going to say, and where is the EU coming down on their side? I mean, are they upset, number one, that the referendum was even held?
I think they're upset about it because it means they've got to deal with Brexit on top of everything else they're dealing with. They're still dealing with Greece.
Sure.
I mean, you and I have talked before about Greece and the Eurozone crisis. That's not over yet. They have the refugee crisis from Syria, which is really the overwhelming issue facing them. Just recently, they've run into problems with a very large trade deal they negotiated with Canada that has now been put on hold because one region of Belgium has refused to accept the agreement.
Oh, boy.
So they have their hands full, and they have elections coming up in France in the spring, in Germany next fall, where leaders such as Hollande and Merkel will be contesting. So the last thing they really need is Brexit.
Right. So it's sounding like it's really in the UK's best interest to try and negotiate a deal as quickly as possible with the EU, because if that 2-year period runs out, they're going to be in trouble.
They're out. They're out without anything. And
exactly, which I don't think is a place that the UK wants to be.
Yeah.
So do you think that the EU is going to be, I'll use the word punitive, in their approach to their negotiations?
I don't think they'll be punitive, but I think they'll be very tough. They're not going to give up on free movement. That is a red line for them. And they will not give up on that. And
do you think that will be a deal breaker?
It will be, unless the British figure an ingenious way to sort of work around that. And there is some possibility they could come up with something that actually is something that David Cameron negotiated in February as his deal that led him to say, okay, I've renegotiated, I got this, now let's have a referendum. They might be able to finesse that issue. The British might be able to finesse that, but the EU is going to be very tough in its negotiation because the EU market is much more important for the UK than the British market is for the EU as a whole. And everyone knows that. And the EU also has very powerful leverage in this, not only the 2-year clock that will just start ticking, but also there are 27 member states. So all of them have to be satisfied in this deal. Also, the European Parliament has to approve a deal.
Right.
So it's, their hands are going to be tied in so many ways that ultimately it's going to be the case that I think the EU will decide what the deal will be, and the UK will have to accept it.
Right.
And
I think that's how it's going to go down.
And then they will have to tell their voters in May 2020 that they got the deal that is in the best interests of the UK.
Right.
But now then there's an additional wrinkle in all of this, of course, which is Scotland.
Okay.
Because Scotland has made it very clear that since they voted overwhelmingly to stay in, that they are going to be very attentive to whether their interests will be served in whatever deal the UK negotiates. And if not, they will hold another independence referendum, and in fact put forward a bill, an independence referendum bill last week, holding that in reserve in case they don't get the deal they want.
So they will separate from the UK
If
if they don't get to stay in the EU?
What the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, of the Scottish National Party is saying, we are going to try to get our deal, the best deal we can get for Scotland, in the Brexit negotiation. But if we don't get that, and if our interests are challenged and hurt by the Brexit agreement, then we will go forward with a referendum.
Right.
Because her view is that it's democratically unacceptable, those are the words she used, for Scotland, which voted 62% in favor of remaining, to have to leave the single market.
Right.
Even if the UK leaves the EU, Scotland wants to retain membership in the single market, and that means soft Brexit.
Right.
So there are many powerful voices pulling Theresa May, as much as she may resist it, toward a soft Brexit solution. And my guess would be at the end of the day, that's probably what we'll get. But no one wants to say that yet, because that antagonizes the Brexiters.
Right, right. Well, I think it'll be a very interesting process to watch over the next several months to see how things play out.
Several months and years. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, David, for being here with us today and giving us
You're welcome.
your update on Brexit. For more information about Professor Cameron and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.